Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the Royal Statistical Society, and particularly welcome this evening to our biennial Beveridge Lecture, named in honour of William Beveridge, who was President of the Society in 1941 and 42. And it's a great moment in the Society's calendar to have a lecture named after William Beveridge, because he believed, as I think everyone in this room believes, that statistics only really are worth doing if they make an impact on the world, and William Beveridge was certainly one of those who showed that in a really significant way that's made massive changes to the way our country is run through the welfare state and the NHS. So it's lovely to remember him, remember his legacy, and to have a lecture that helps us remind ourselves of that legacy and inspire us in our own workplaces and universities and wherever it is we are, that our duty as statisticians is to make a difference, and for those of you who are not statisticians, to welcome statisticians into your communities to help make a difference more widely in society. So it's wonderful to welcome you here for that this evening. This year is also the 180th anniversary of the Society, and so we have themed this lecture as part of a series of 180th anniversary events. And the last one we had David Cox reminiscing on statistics that he's been involved in over most of his now 90-year life. And we have two further ones, just to whet your appetite. Gus O'Donnell is coming in October, and Jill Matheson hopefully in November or December, to share their thoughts on statistics and the Society 180 years on. So do make a note of those and look out for the dates as we advertise them. But this evening, and focusing us on this evening, we're doing this lecture jointly with the Institute for Government, and over the last couple of years we've been cultivating a relationship with the Institute for Government where we have a lot of common areas of interest, particularly around mobilising the power of data to impact on the public policy process and understanding how statistical thinking can improve decision making, particularly in Whitehall, but more generally in the public realm. So it is a wonderful honour to introduce Peter Riddell as our speaker this evening. Peter and I have known each other for quite a long time, and Peter had a distinguished journalistic career with the Financial Times and the Times, but we first got to know each other when he was on a commission on the communication of parliamentary democracy, chaired by another good friend, David Putnam, thinking about the importance of making connections between people and the way they are governed, and that has a link into one of the languages that statistics has to make those connections. So Peter and I have worked in that. My current job in Parliament has been very actively engaged in that particular realm, but Peter has been the chair of the Hansard Society, the charity which is focused on strengthening democracy, and I think that will be another theme maybe that will come out from Peter's talk this evening. So it's a great delight to welcome you, Peter. Thank you very much for coming along, and thank you also for agreeing to have this as a joint lecture between your institution and Peter is the Chief Executive of the Institute for Government and the Royal Statistical Society, and I hope this is just another step along the road of a relationship that will get deeper and deeper. But Peter, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much indeed for that, John. I'm absolutely delighted to be here this evening. The 180th anniversary, we had a little celebration yesterday of the 5th anniversary of moving into our building in Castle Gardens, and the IFG being founded effectively about 6 years ago. So 5 to 6 years compared with 180, we've got a long way to go. I'm honoured to be delivering the Beveridge Lecture for two main reasons. First, the name Beveridge, as John said, epitomises better policy making based on evidence. Beveridge, is looking at the board up there, a former president of the Royal Statistical Society. Interesting, at the time he was president, he wasn't exactly inactive in what he was doing. And he wasn't the easiest man to work with. As Harold Wilson, once his research assistant and another former president of the Royal Statistical Society when he was leader of the opposition, but which is very interesting to think of in the current context. Harold Wilson noted in one of his many volumes of memoirs, I found him, Beveridge, a devil to work for. He woke me each morning at 7. And put in a stint of 2 hours' work with him before breakfast. Now we know why statisticians look so lean and hungry. Moreover, Wilson noted, when I started working with Beveridge, that was in the early 40s when he was president of the society, I soon found that although he was ruthless at getting at the facts and drove me as hard as he drove himself, he had certain ingrained views about unemployment, still derived from the historic study he had made in 1909. Tom Hopkinson, another observer of the 40s, noted, however, that Beveridge's urbane assurance of his own superiority, turning rapidly to irritation were he in any way challenged, alienated many of those whose backing he most needed. Indeed, the hostility which his manner provoked might well have destroyed the effect of all his valuable work, but for the extreme good fortune in the matter of timing. So he was a mixed blessing in some respects, but he was a great believer in the use of evidence to improve policy making. And if you look at the first report on social insurance and allied services, the one allegedly Mrs. Thatcher carried around with her, along with many other works, Hayek as well, the two must have kind of fought against each other in a handbag. If you look at that report, what's striking is not only the fact that it's extremely well written, I mean, it's a very clear read, in a certain, now a slightly older style, but also the use of detailed evidence about what was happening. My second reason that being honoured to deliver this lecture is the record of the Royal Statistical Society itself, in arguing for the effective use of statistics in the public interest, as John said in his introduction, so that in the words of the 2013 annual report, policy formulation and decision making are informed by evidence for the good of society. You've done this in many ways, from spreading statistical literacy to encouraging the increasing relevance of statistics for students, not just the growing number taking maths beyond GCSE, but also in other subjects. I'd also like to pay particular tribute to the work of your departing president, John Pullinger, whom, as John indicated, we've known each other and become good friends over the last decade. At first, in the work he described, he's been doing in House of Commons, and when we worked together on various commissions and so on. And John has spread enlightenment in the House of Commons in ways not always in the easiest of circumstances. And I find it remarkable what he's not only achieved, but he's survived against the forces of unbelief and perhaps occasionally darkness. So for him to end his job at the weekend, standing up, as far as I can tell, outwardly unscarred, but with an enormous achievement to his credit, is a tribute to him and to the views he holds. I'm absolutely delighted about his appointment as National Statistician. For once, absolutely the right person for the job. When I heard, I thought, what a fantastic appointment, because I know John will fill the post with considerable distinction. The ONS has a crucial role in upholding standards and in holding ministers and departments to account if they publish misleading statistics. This is crucial for honest government. I'd also like to commend the work of various independent bodies dedicated to this task, notably Full Fact. And I might enter a kind of personal note here. John mentioned I was a journalist. In the closest involvement I had, well, I shouldn't say that actually, because throughout my journalistic career I was concerned with statistics. I ran the polling for the Times for 7 or 8 years, but I was economics correspondent of the FT between 76 and 81. When actually I probably appreciated the need for integrity in handling data. I was very lucky working with the FT because there weren't the pressures there are on a lot of papers. But I think the new press regulator would do well to talk to Full Fact as well as the RSS and regard this work of statistical integrity as central to its remit. It's not just unethical intrusions and false accusations that so damage the press, it's also the misleading use of statistics and factual information. And indeed, I think that's much harder to correct than allegations about people's personal lives. The media are very slow to correct such misreporting of fact, and I think there is a big task there. And I think there is an interesting opening with the new press regulator. These remarks are relevant to my main theme of better informed policy making. As John said, I'm Director, Chief Executive of the Institute for Government, which for those of you who don't know what we do, is a charity set up nearly 6 years ago with a mission of improving the effectiveness of government. The inspiration came from David Sainsbury, Lord Sainsbury of Turville, who concluded after 8 years as Science Minister the government didn't work very well. He meant by that the processes and machinery of government, not the policies. And he's in a position to do something about it. His Gatsby Foundation remains the main funder of the IFG, and it's a long-term committed funder, which makes my task easier in deciding what we do work on. We work closely with civil servants, ministers, MPs, and a wide range of outside bodies. And I'd absolutely endorse, we want to take forward the relationship with the RSS on a whole range of data issues. And in fact, there's an enormous overlap on that. We're very keen to do so. And I hope my remarks will indicate where there's an affinity of interest. We're not a conventional think tank. Not only in the sense we're strictly non-partisan, we're not like many very eminent think tanks, but who have a clear party allegiance. In one respect, we're more akin to something like the Institute for Fiscal Studies, where in fact a number of my colleagues worked originally. But also because we're not just interested in producing reports and holding events, although we do a lot of both, but our prime aim is to work with and influence government. We involve key decision makers, both in preparing our reports and later in disseminating them. We don't expect immediate results, and quite often don't get them, and we don't seek dramatic headlines. A lot of our work is private, very confidential, non-confrontational, trying to persuade politicians and civil servants that what we're proposing is in their best interests. Now, improving policy making is one of our central themes, for the simple and actually blindingly obvious reason that getting policy right is a prerequisite for effective government. Of course, reasonable people can differ on what the right policy objective is. That is the essence of democracy. Our concern is over the true frequent confusion of means and ends. That a passionate commitment to an end can lead to underestimating the problems of ensuring that the policy works in practice. At the Institute for Government, we've looked not just at what has gone wrong, but also at policy successes. Under the lead and drive of my colleague Joe Rutter, a former civil servant, we held a series of witness seminars, which we called policy reunions, appropriately, which pulled together politicians, officials, commentators who've been involved in various policies. And we looked at policies that worked. Pensions reform after the Turner Report, the introduction of the national minimum wage, and earlier privatisation. We also conducted an absolutely fascinating study into the success of the 2012 Olympics. That was as a project, not how many gold medals we won, which is direct relevance to the debate now on how to run major infrastructure projects. I mean, it was really interesting, and where you can draw the parallels and where you can't. It does help to have a deadline, of course. But they're actually much more interesting lessons. There are clear lessons from all this work about the need to identify the problem, seeking wide agreement on solution, if possible, creating cross-party agreement to avoid the all too frequent policy reversals after general elections, and establishing clear lines of accountability in running a project. A central principle is that policy and implementation cannot be divided, and that policy making without regard to implementation often leads to disasters. After these reunions, but before the Olympics, we produced a report in 2011 called Making Policy Better, subtitled Improving Whitehall's Core Business. It's quite an interesting sub-phrase, which I'll come back to, by Mike Halsworth and Joe Rutter. Its starting point was that no one in departments or at the centre has responsibility for ensuring that policy making is of high quality, and the system responds effectively to ministers' priorities. That's partly because in many departments, wide range of civil servants see themselves as in the policy business, and therefore the actual responsibility isn't clear-cut. Accordingly, we suggested the appointment of a policy director in each department, an extension of accounting officer responsibilities to cover streamlined policy assessments available for public scrutiny. At the heart of all these suggestions was a belief in the need for better informed policy making. In particular, has the policy process been informed by evidence that is high quality and up to date? Has evidence been taken of evaluations of previous policies? Have policymakers sought out and analysed ideas and experience from the front line, overseas and devolved administrations? On policy design, have policymakers rigorously tested whether the policy design is realistic, involving implementers and users? And all this, of course, relies on good data to make any sense of it at all. All this is to ensure better informed policy making. So better informed policy making is by definition more open policy making. The initial response to the report in Whitehall was distinctly cool. I'd be fair to say we got the brush off. with more than a hint of we in Whitehall know about policy making because that's what we spend all our time doing. It's our core business. Perhaps we suffered from having that as a subtitle of the report and don't need outside advice. Fortunately, that changed. I mean, when I took over as director, we were in a slightly, policy making was a problem area for us because we produced what we all regard as a good report, but there was no response from Whitehall. I mean, if anything, it was rather negative, apart from some medium and junior level people who were rather keen on what we were doing. However, that changed in 2012 when the Civil Service Reform Plan was being prepared and ideas were being sought on policy making. We then found a more positive attitude as new initiatives were sought to improve policy making, in particular by the Policy Profession Board, which was then taken over by Chris Wormold from the Education Department. This led to the publication of a report on 12 actions to professionalise policy making, launched actually at the Institute with Chris Wormold and Oliver Letwin last October, which specifically took forward several of our proposals. A number of organisational changes were suggested, but the key proposals were about open policy making, notably the creation of the Contestable Policy Fund, the What Works Centres and Policy Lab. Before discussing these initiatives, first a word of caution, which has been implicit in what I've been saying earlier. There's a danger of treating policy making as all-embracing activity for civil servants, in effect a replacement for the old civil service term of generalists. Everyone is a policy maker who isn't a specialist, and there's an interesting paradox there that statisticians and economists are sometimes not regarded as policy makers, even though they're absolutely crucial to the policy making process. And some of the categorization can actually be inimical to good policy making. And one of the things we found, quite interestingly, and the same is true of actually the finance people too, although I think they've made more progress in the last few years, particularly under the lead of John Thompson, who's now the Permanent Secretary of the Ministry of Defence, that the categorisation of specialists, the advance of specialists, is a good thing in itself, but it can lead to a bit of an exclusion. I mean, the Treasury being an exception, I'll be very interested in what Gus O'Donnell says about that, because Gus is, well, in a sense, he's in two positions on this. Keen to advance economists, but also recognising, I think, all the issues I've been talking about. It's interesting that around 17,000 people identified themselves as working in policy roles across the civil service. Now, in a sense, that's an absurdly large group in a much reduced civil service. And I think tighter definitions will be required, and also fewer exclusions. You know, excluding statisticians, economists, and so on is daft if you're looking at policy making. So there are perversities in the desire to professionalise could lead to silos which are actually inimical to the process of improving policy making. It's too early to assess the impact of the various initiatives, but let me outline them. The Contestable Policy Fund to commission policy development work from outside the civil service. This is an inherently good idea. Who can object to getting policy ideas from outside? However, it was based on the slightly misleading assumption that Whitehall was closed to outside ideas. Some of the language used a couple of years ago was, you know, we want to end the monopoly of policy making in Whitehall. Well, that actually ended about 40 years ago. The Thatcher years, when many of the key ideas, such as privatisation, actually came from outside Whitehall. The real role of civil servants then was to analyse them and make them practicable. I mean, the intellectual energy on privatisation and many other policies of the Thatcher years came from outside, but it was a number of key civil servants and the people who translated that into implementable policy. Also, of course, again, one's got to view this Contestable Policy Fund, which led to headlines, you know, possibly outsourced to X and Y and Z, is again slightly misleading, because the assessment of policies and advice to ministers will remain with civil servants and advisors, as before. Nonetheless, formalising outside advice is, to my mind, wholly desirable. Initially, most attention was on a project on accountability in the civil service, basically ministerial, permanent secretary relations, the appointment of permanent secretaries, and various related quite contentious subjects, particularly in the last 2 or 3 years. That was conducted by the IPPR think tank, commissioned by Francis Maud, the Minister for the Civil Service. We were approached to put in a bid for it, and we didn't, partly because we were already doing work on that area, and also because we valued our independence. I mean, there are ambiguities for outside bodies in getting involved in such work. we decided, and I had no regrets whatsoever, even though there was quite a large sum of money involved, the advantage of secure funding, I might say, that we would carry on with the project we were already doing, which actually was rolled out with a series of reports, mainly last year, and I think it was quite successful in that way. We worked very closely with IPPR, and we got very close personal relations with the people who were doing the project, but they got essentially caught up in arguments between ministers and civil servants, and it was quite a bruising process. And I think that it's a slightly, the report has been enthusiastically endorsed by Francis Maude, but less enthusiastically by some civil servants. And I think that wasn't a good precedent. Less noticed, and one of my colleagues challenged me on this when I was doing some initial work to write this lecture, I wondered how many other projects there were in the Contestable Policy Fund. It turns out that 15 other projects have been launched, ranging from psychological well-being and work, actually something Gus O'Donnell is very committed to because he's very involved in trying the well-being agenda, via the important topic of funded public service pension schemes, where some very interesting work was done indeed, to improving maths skills in the vocational sector after 16, right up the RSS agenda. Those projects are very sensible. There remains, however, the suspicion that some of these projects might anyway have occurred, and there's been a kind of diversion from departmental research budgets. So I've got a little bit of skepticism on that. These things happen, and why not use the money that's around? The What Works centres cover health and social care, educational attainment, ageing better, local growth, crime reduction, and effective early intervention. The centres, which are independent charities, are intended to summarise research on what works best in practice and what doesn't work, and share their conclusions with local and national decision makers. I think this is a really good idea. In a sense, some of them have been much longer established than others. I mean, some are just going through a transition, in a sense. I think the real challenge for them is to avoid, and I hope I don't offend the academics in the audience, and if I do, I think you'll recognise the dilemma of academic capture. The great danger of them being captured by enthusiasts of particular solutions. I think their value will be that they synthesise and look at the alternative views of what works, rather than get captured by a particular view. I mean, it's quite a danger when you set up centres like that. They become advocates for a particular approach. I mean, we all know it in medicine, and of course the parallels in such exercises in medicine, that a particular view is taken forward, rather than, and there isn't an openness to alternative approaches. And I think one of the real challenges, and I was talking to one of the centres only a couple of weeks ago, was them to be open-minded about alternative approaches rather than just get fixated on a particular approach. And I think that's quite a challenge for them. But I think what it will do, I hope, is allow not only local providers, and the focus is very much on local providers, commissioners of services in health, local authorities, more complicated now in education, obviously, also police and crime commissioners and chief constables, to see a range and to see, the word best practice perhaps carries certain connotations, but essentially good practice from around the country. And for example, the Early Intervention Foundation, which is a really admirable thing, which actually was launched by Graham Allen, the MP. He's now stepping down, and it's been taken forward in other hands. I've got 20 places around the country where they're looking at early intervention and intending to spread the practice to other areas, make it better known and so on. And I think there's some very good hopes there of just, particularly on a more micro level, of good policy being based on evidence. We at the Institute have been partially involved in this area. We're doing a project with the big lottery, whereby we are bringing people from Whitehall, this in Whitehall rather than local government, together with local charities which are providers of services, particularly on some of the problems of the long-term youth unemployed and in that area. And which has been absolutely fascinating. We've been doing it for a year, and we just got a contract for another year, whereby one of my colleagues coordinates this, where I said we get medium-level policymakers in Whitehall and these local providers. And what's been really interesting about it, and this is true of the What Works centres, is the enthusiasm of civil servants for it. They've been keen. One of the problems has been the lack of capacity in some of the local charities to do it, but it's generally it's a great success, and it's produced some very interesting work, which has certainly interested Whitehall. A further innovation has been the Policy Lab, which is intended to test how design principles and methods can improve the quality and deliverability of policy. I think this is an example of kind of cross-disciplinary work, which is very useful. Service design aims to shed new light on what services people really need and what a better solution might look like. There have been many such labs in the private sector, though fewer in the public sector. The pioneers have been predictably in Scandinavia, but there have also been such policy labs in Washington, DC and Australia. At the IFG, we hosted the founder of the Helsinki Design Lab to a packed audience last year, showing the degree of interest in this approach. Now, all these innovations are really about ensuring that decisions are better informed, that information is available. Some of that's statistical, some of it is the experience of pilots and experiments. Now, there are arcane debates, at least to me, about randomized controlled trials, again, where people feel passionately one part of the argument or another part of the argument. I'm not going to get into that tonight, and I'm not qualified to address those. But the trouble is, this debate can sound very much for the policy specialists. I asked a senior minister, himself a supporter of these changes, if any of his cabinet colleagues knew about the work of opening up and professionalising policymaking. His typically candid answer was no. It's very much a civil service-led initiative, though crucially, with the enthusiastic backing of Sir Jeremy Hayward, the Cabinet Secretary and Chief Policy Coordinator at the top of government. The next step, however, is to ensure that ministers themselves feel that these changes are in their interest rather than meant to frustrate their instincts and preferences. I think there's a real tension here between the world of the policy specialist, the official advisor, and the world of politicians and their advisors. That has not been bridged so far. This is very much, in a sense, you can see it's partly a reaction to the enthusiasm of the ministers and their advisors, that you've got the Whitehall trying to prove itself as being innovative and good in policy making. That's a thoroughly good thing. And Jeremy Hayward, to all credit, and he's rightly proud of all this, but it's very much a civil service space, not a political space. And I think the real test, next test, will be political. We will only have better informed policy making if the politicians are willing to listen. And quite often they're not. Now, this partly, and my remaining remarks are essentially more about politics. Too often, opposition parties come into office with new policy proposals, devised with the help of some of their close advisors and sympathetic think tanks and pressure groups, but which have not been tested for practicability and deliverability. There's quite a closed world often of opposition policy making, and with limited resources, very limited resources, where the shrewd pressure groups know how to influence the opposition. Indeed, there's often a suspicion of civil servants when whom new ministers fear, usually wrongly, of wanting to water down their cherished ideas. That in turn leads civil servants to be not challenging enough to new ministers rather than obstructive. So I think we have a traditional model which is not conducive to testing out a policy, and I think there's some problems there. Now, the Institute for Government has done a lot of work, not only on policy making, but also, and this is where I've been personally very involved, but also on transitions from one party in office to another. To my mind, there are two key lessons which are relevant to the policy making and improving policy making, ensure it's better informed. First, parties in opposition need to be very careful in making policy commitments. They need to think about implementation. Promises sound easy, but delivering on them can be difficult, it can be costly and politically damaging. We worked with the Conservatives and to a lesser extent the Lib Dems before the 2010 election, explaining the workings of Whitehall and trying to produce some realism in that way. We're now working with Labour in opposition, as well as in a different way with the two coalition parties. I mean, some of the work we're doing, particularly on policy making and implementation, we're also doing with the Tories and Lib Dems now in government, and they're very interested in it. But primarily, obviously, the opposition aspect is with Labour, in helping them to prepare for the possibility of office. I emphasise the possibility of office, understanding the policy process and the problems of implementation. We've got a big report coming on implementation in mid-July, which looks at some case studies of where information came in. And it's very interesting, the flow of information coming in to these case studies of policies, the London Challenge in Education, for example, one of them, the auto-enrolment of pensions, another, and the development of sure to start into children's centres, and look at how, actually it's very interesting how the role, the learning process of evidence coming through that and how it interacts with politics. Second, when parties take office, we believe they should reflect rather than rush into new initiatives. The 100-day syndrome has much to answer for. One can understand why FDR in March 1933, and remember there was an enormous gap between when he was elected in November 1932 and taking office, when the US economy and the banking system were literally collapsing, in every sense, were collapsing. But he refused to intervene, saying that was for Hoover. And the 100 days were necessary to ensure that the US economy survived. And, but unfortunately, it's not the best example to use for normal transitions. The late Jock Bruce Gardine, an independent-minded, even maverick Tory MP, briefly also a minister and for a long time a journalist, once wrote a book with Nigel Lawson, his close friend, arguing that new government should not announce any new policies for 100 days. And I remember talking to Jock about it, this is 30 years ago. I think it's fair to say that it's clearly unrealistic, given political and media pressures for a new government to be seen to be taking charge. What the unlikely figure of Geoffrey Howe once said to me was the 5th Cavalry or 7th Cavalry arriving. I find it difficult to think of Geoffrey Howe invoking the US cavalry arriving in time to save the, everyone, but he invoked that. There's an element of that. People expect when they've got a new government there that there'll be change and so on. And also the need to announce a new legislative programme within a month or most of the election. But new government should consider dividing their policy announcement into two groups. First, their urgent priorities, measures which they believe they want to introduce from the start. And a classic one in 2010 was the setting up of the Office for Budget Responsibility. I was careful to get the for rather than of in OBR, as my friend Robert Choate points out to me. And that's setting that up, which I think has been a thoroughly good thing, was a very early part of legislation in George Osborne's programme, along with various other measures. Now, these measures can and should be discussed with the civil service during the access talks or contacts in the months before the election. I mean, it'll be from this mid-October, after the party conferences, that Labour, it'll just be Labour this time, can talk to permanent secretaries about plans. Officially, civil service are in a listening mode, but certainly in early legislative priorities, and we ourselves believe that these should be broadened a bit to look at early implementation, so there is clarity on early legislation. So the civil service, I mean, in 1997, exactly the same happened on some of the early legislation of the Blair government, the numeracy and literacy hours, which David Blunkett brought in, and various other changes in that period. It is very useful to have those conversations, which don't undermine what the civil service is doing for the current government, because it's normally ring-fenced amongst a few advisors. But we believe that those should be really open exchanges on early legislation, because all governments are going to have bills which they introduce within a few weeks coming to office, so don't pretend it isn't going to happen. However, more longer-lasting proposals where new government should set out their views in only the broadest terms and then consult on detail. That's where the open policy-making process can be helpful. To look at what has worked in the past, to have trials and pilots. And I think this is crucially, if one's talking about better informed policy-making. Political parties, politicians have instincts. They need to be tested. This is not a sense of diluting them, a kind of anonymized civil service weakening them, nothing like that. But it is a time to get things right. Just look at some of the policy problems of recent decades. Tax credits, the outsourcing of training, the NHS reform, universal credit. How much better might have been the outcome if ministers had allowed time for consultation and discussion. for the gathering of evidence, to looking at what had worked, and also above all what hadn't worked. Looking at data, I reckon the changes would actually been introduced on the same time scale. Because if you look at what happened in the NHS bill, they had to, quotes, pause it in the House of Lords. That's partly political, but it was also had other factors. Similarly, I won't go into what is euphemistically described by the Major Projects Authority as the reset on universal credit. Can I reset my tax payments? And you look at that. If they'd paused, not rushed, things would have been a lot better. But new governments want to rush things. That's why I think the division I suggest between your absolute early priorities and the longer lasting measures is desirable. I want to stress I'm not urging a kind of depoliticized version of decision making by experts. I'm not in favor of the belief that in a sense, the very 1940s, stretching the 50s, view of a very centralized, Whitehall-based group of experts who knew what was best for people. If you read David Kinniston's books, which are wonderful on post-war social history, wonderful use of data in them, looking at what happened in town planning after the war, show that view. I'm not actually arguing that at all. What I'm arguing is I recognize that parties, voters have different interests and views which representative democracy is intended to reconcile. What I am urging is that policy making will be much improved if more time is given to hear and examine the evidence. I think that's possible because basically better informed is usually plain better. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Peter. You've given us an encyclopedic view of the changing policy landscape and how evidence better applied within that landscape would make a difference. But I hope you're now open for questions from our audience. Questions for Peter? Denise? Oh, there's a microphone coming. If you could let Peter know who you are first.
Okay. Denise Leavesley. I'm Dean of Social Science at King's College London. You started off when you were talking about the Institute by saying that a lot of the advice you give is private. One of the challenges for us is when we give advice in private and when we go public on it. And I wondered if you could say a few words about how you make that decision and under what circumstances you give private advice, and whether there's any difference because you're non-partisan in this respect, and whether if you were in a university that was publicly funded, you would feel differently.
That's a very interesting issue. I'd qualify my answer in a way is that we do a lot of what we call safe space stuff at the Institute. We bring together people who wouldn't necessarily be seen, I won't say seen in the same room together, be quite happy to be in the same room together, but they wouldn't have candid discussions together if it was a public event. When I hosted one yesterday for two very important groups in British society, and they had a very interesting discussion about their views, and I think that's absolutely right to be private. Various public things will emerge from it. What I meant by that was not that what we're saying is stuff we haven't said publicly, but the way we convey it to civil servants, to say the opposition parties, is done confidentially because there's no contradiction between, say, what we're doing, say some stuff with Labour now, on implementation and policy making. Well, we always said that publicly. There's nothing secret what we're saying, but we're doing it in a private context. What I'm really saying there is the context in which we're doing it is private. Similarly, I speak at a number of seminars, conferences for civil servants. Well, by definition, these are, for candour, these are private events. What I'm saying, some of which I've said tonight in certain areas, I mean, what I've just said in the last bit of my lecture on transitions and so on, I've expressed publicly, but I'm discussing it with them privately. And also, a very important part of what we're doing, and it's the advantage actually of our secure funding, is to not confront people, try and persuade them. I mean, I keep saying my team are actually very good on this. We're trying to persuade people it's in their best interests to follow some of our suggestions. bashing around the head and saying you've failed isn't the best way to do it. It's a very delicate balance, which we don't always get right. We've had our clashes with the civil service in recent months over various things when it's thought that some of our views have been a little brutal for them, and occasionally things go up and down in that respect. Well, that's life. But in general, the emphasis on what we're trying to do is constructive. We're trying to improve things, not just saying you're rotten. We're trying to make things better. Often that's better done in private, but the actual basic views we express, everything is public, everything is on our website, but we'll sometimes express it more privately. And I'd say that applies to 95% of what we do. I suppose about 95% of our views. There's about 5% of it which is very sensitive. Some of it's to do with people, some of it's to do with related things where we don't immediately go public with our view. We'll express it privately to ministers and civil servants because it's more productive to do that. But in general, the views we express are totally open, totally on the website. Indeed, we've made a principle for the briefing we do to the political parties for the elections is we won't say anything which we haven't said publicly. That's our rule for the team, 4 people doing it. And that's our rule, even though the forum where we're doing it, and exactly, I mean, it applies, we're totally non-partisan. We did exactly the same with the Tories last time. We're doing some stuff for Tories and Lib Dems in a different way, obviously, because they're in government. And the product will be remarkably similar, but we'll obviously express it in different ways. So that's an interesting balance on that. And I have some trustees who are robust, representatives of all 3 main parties on them, which works rather well, plus a serving permanent secretary, and some people from industry. And so I've got to be accountable to them on what I do. But so I wouldn't, what I'd say is the means of communication is often private. And the safe space stuff is very important. I mean, it's a slight tangent, but I think it's a very relevant one. I've been increasingly struck, even since my journalistic days, at how there are different tribes of people around. I mean, John's actually is already bridged, in the sense he's going back to a world rather than going to a wholly new world on Tuesday, of civil servants. Parliament is so culturally different from Whitehall. I'm just startled by it. Even though I reported on it as an outsider, when I've seen it from the quasi-inside, as I have for the last 4 years, how different it is. I've also, for example, I have quite a lot of contact with the judiciary. We're doing some work with them. Their world is wholly different from the world of Whitehall and of Parliament. I mean, they are. I mean, the idea that they were once in Westminster Hall is and a very different. And the academic world, media world, wholly different. I mean, I find myself psychologically feeling very different from my old colleagues in the media because I see things so differently now. You know, I've got lots of chums there, lots of friends there, and I talk to them. But I do find the way I view things, and that's true in many respects. So that's where I think one of the things, opportunities I have is to bring people together a bit.
Thank you. So one in the middle, this side, and then over that side. Yes, please.
Hi, my name's Jenny North. I work for an organisation called Impetus PEF, and among other things, we co-manage the EEF, which is one of the What Works centres. And, I was interested in what you said about the RCT debate being quite arcane, but of course that is mainly what the What Works centres deal in, particularly the EEF certainly is there to commission and run RCTs. And really, it's the What Works Centre's potential gift to civil servants and policymakers. But what I worry about is whether there's an appetite within civil service and also at local authority level for this gift. And whether they know how to bridge the gap between RCT that worked there into this will work here, and I know what I need to implement this with my population. And I wondered if you could comment a bit on what you see as the evidence readiness, perhaps, of central government, but also of local government, and what needs to be done to build that ability to implement the What Works knowledge.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a very interesting issue indeed. I think the first thing is I would not talk about RCTs. I think there's a challenge for you and the other What Works centres, and that's why I say there's a danger of a kind of capture. And I think that's one of the real, I mean, when they're kind of redesignated and set up last year, my scepticism had been, hold on, are you just funneling some money out to people to do, one, what they're already doing, but to recognise that the centres have got to do something new, and that's communication. And I think the real challenge is actually getting over the language barrier. I mean, I'm very much a lay person in this. I'm not a detailed policy analyst. I say my career was as a journalist for 40 years, and it's only in the last few years that I've moved into a different area. But is talking in an accessible way. That's half the answer. I think there is an appetite in central government. I certainly sense there is. I mean, we had a seminar last week on some of the work we're doing with the big lottery, which is directly relevant to what you're doing. It could easily be what work centre thing, with 15 DGs from around Whitehall discussing some initiatives. And it was absolutely fascinating. They were really committed to it. They're really taking in the evidence. And these are pretty high level sophistication. I think there's certainly an appetite in central government. My worry is, does it stop at clever civil servants? Does it penetrate the politicians? I mean, you're right. I can think of 2 or 3 it might penetrate, but not many others. And therefore, that's why I say communication and language are so important. Local government, it depends. In some cases, yes, but it's entirely dependent on the individuals. So they're hard pressed, they're stretched. They say, look, we're dealing with the problem, the fact that the system doesn't cope with problem families, say, or whatever. We haven't got time for this. Again, it comes back to communication, making it relevant for them. And I think one of what work centres can operate well is almost pre-packaging solutions. That here's a solution which you don't have to read through an academic paper for, but you could actually say, here's something which did work, simply explained in terms which are relevant to some director of services in a hard-pressed local authority, rather than diverting them into RCTs and all that. I think it's the simplicity of it. One of my colleagues at the Institute is on secondment to I think it would be fair to say, troubled London local authority working on children's services. And he comes back, he's going to be on secondment for about a year. And I said, right, you come and brief us every 3 months, give us updates, as well as just keeping in touch with me as, on a personnel basis. And absolutely fascinating to have him sit around the table and go through. And I was saying, well, what about what's happening with work centres? And he kind of scratched his. And this is someone who's a complete policy guy. Was essentially politely put, if only I had the time. That's why the communication, I think, comes in.
I'll press you on the question a little bit. And the question was really about information readiness. And you said in one breath that the appetite was there, but then you finished with an example like that.
That was local government. I was distinguishing central and local there. I mean, I think the local government is pressure of time. I think at the centre, and maybe just the people I mix with, and I think it probably is, it's self-selecting. It's the people who've got an appetite to do it anyway. I think at the centre, there's a key, partly, as I said in my talk, I think that the centre has almost a desire to say, we can do policy, and we don't have to be battered around the head all the time by the politicians. We want to prove we've got a legitimate space on policy. I think there are contrasts. That's why I think your point on central and local. So that was the contrast I was bringing. I think there's a problem at a local level, merely with capacity. At a central level, I think there is more of a desire, partly because they set it up. They set up the initiatives. There's more of a commitment. But again, it's amongst certain civil servants, because of where they are.
Okay. Gentleman in the middle.
I'm Prashant Vazay. I work at Nest Pensions, and I used to work as a civil servant and economist in various departments. I've just got 2 questions, really. I mean, you put a lot of emphasis on this idea that we should make use of greater data in policy making. And I think many of the examples you gave were kind of premised on the kind of policies which essentially it's government delivered. But a huge amount of the policies, especially ones I've worked in, have been delivered by the private sector. And I think 2 of the things that I found quite challenging when I've worked in government, especially on the evaluations and impact assessments, has been the lack of transparency about costs. I mean, as soon as you start getting into commercial and confidence data, then suddenly the rest of the world just clams up. Very little data available on this, and you end up having very, very kind of essentially tactically placed information on costing, which depends on which side of the fence is making the arguments. The second issue is some of the services that you talk about are now often delivered by arm's length delivery bodies. I mean, I can remember having a conversation in my local borough where I work about evaluating the waste contract and the kind of effectiveness of energy, the recycling. And it turned out the way that the contract had been written, it was almost impossible to get any data out of the provider. Just the very basic stuff of what day particular houses would have waste collected on. So forget about kind of anything at all interesting about how effective various changes might be. And I think a third issue is a perennial one. Everybody's always very keen on evaluation, but the life expectancy of most ministers, certainly ones when I was working in Whitehall, within a job is 1 to 2 years, and that's often true of senior civil servants as well. So the idea that they've got the time and patience to actually evaluate, or that they even think that they're getting anything useful out of an international comparison or a time series comparison, is often not borne out. So we've been saying evaluate for God knows how long. We've been saying get data. Yeah, of course, but often it's not freely available. I think some of the challenges with nowadays data, certainly with nest pensions, we have big data sets. It takes a very careful and detailed knowledge of IT systems to actually extract data, and often that kind of stuff is just not available. I wonder if who in HMRC is able to really proper exploit real-time data there. Anyway, those are some reflections.
No, I take both your points. I think we've done quite a lot of work on public sector markets and commissioning and outsourcing. And one of our absolutely central things is on data. That a lot of the data is completely obscure. It's disguised under commercial confidentiality when it's public money. And I think there has to be a change in the nature of the contracts. There are moves in that direction. It's quite interesting because of some of the big contractor disasters. Companies which are very good at bidding for contracts, but perhaps less good at delivering them. I think there is pressure now for much greater openness on that data, and the defence of commercial confidentiality is decreasing. But I recognise the point you're making on that, and also nowadays it should be, and this is where I sound naive, much easier to access a lot of information because of technology, and I think that I wouldn't say a naive optimist, but I'm more optimistic on that because some of the problems have shown the need, if we're going to do comparisons properly and so on, you've got to have more data, and the commercial confidentiality is a weak excuse from people who are not performing. On your last point, I think there's a lot in that, but equally at a time of public spending restraint and control, when there's a lot of pressure to look for cost-effective policies, that's when there is an incentive to properly evaluate. There is an incentive to have proper data because you're trying to get a policy cheaper. And therefore, if you've got proper data which shows how things work out, you may get to a policy outcome which you can achieve at a cheaper input. So I recognise that. On ministers, actually, one of the interesting things, of course, is partly the result of the coalition. The turnover of ministers has slowed since 2010. We'll see what happens with the reshuffle whenever that happens, but on the whole, it's slowed. Civil servants, I think there was enormous turnover when there were the big cutbacks in 2010-11. Again, that slowed now. My impression has been there's much more, there's a bit more stability. I mean, I remember when I was initially took over as director, I think in one particular job, there was 3 different people in the first 6 months. And that's completely daft, I agree. It's a bit more stable now.
Sharon Witherspoon, Director of the Nuffield Foundation, and may I say a great fan both of the RSS and the Institute for Government. I suppose unusually I'm not going to ask about data, but about how we use the fact that certain types of discussions about evidence are different in different settings. And you mentioned open policy making, which again I think can be very useful, particularly when there's a bit of flexibility, not so much about the absolute end, but about some of the medium-term ends. They're not quite means, but the question is, are we going to reach certain goals? But having been involved and being involved in some of the open policy discussions on data sharing, which is a topic near and dear to the Society's heart, it does make me think, and perhaps it's just my age, about how this relates to the old-fashioned model of the green paper and the white paper. Because when I were a child, you did have a green paper model where things were relatively more open and so on, and then a white paper where much of the consultation was about means-ends consultation. Now, I'm not saying I hark back entirely, but I can't help but think in this case, even with a relatively open set of discussions between people on who take various views about privacy, data sharing, the technical need for data, all sorts of things. I think it would still make for a better bill and a better scrutinised bill if they go through a white paper stage, not least because it may flush out some of the wider public debates that no amount of sitting around a Whitehall table can end. So do you think that we've seen the end of the day of any of those coloured papers?
They won't be called that anyway. I think we might not go back to the same language. But of course, there is one area where there has been improvement, which is on in relation to Parliament, with pre-legislative scrutiny in its various forms. So that legislation, it's far from perfect. And I was looking up the figures for something last week, and there's been many more draft bills published by the coalition over the same period than were published by the Brown government in its last 4 years. Now you can argue different stages of where the government is. But it's interesting, draft bills which are quasi green papers in that way, have had a big impact. There's another public bill procedure in the Commons for looking at bills. So we do have scope for that, and I think there's clear evidence that when that happens, things are improved in that way. And there is more pressure, and I think this is where my point on the politics comes in, of the politicians accepting, actually testing, being willing to be challenged is so crucial. And I can think of a number of ministers who aren't very happy about being challenged. The civil servants on the whole are.
Thank you.
Hitan from the RSS. Peter, you outlined a great set of proposals about how you could get better informed policy, but there's a sense in which they feel quite utopian. What's the political pressure we need to create what's the model of change to actually get us there, and so your reports don't just sort of dustily lie on the shelf? And you've talked about the sophisticated role that you're playing, but it can't just be you. There's a kind of ecosystem of organisations that need to help. And I suppose the final point is, how optimistic are you about all of this?
Wow, being accused of utopian. I'm glad none of my trustees are here. They'd be worried on that score. I don't think I'm being terribly utopian. I'm a gradualist. I think graduate things are slightly better. In some respect, more data is available, much more. There are many more ways of analysing it. I mean, sorry, I got a polite cough. There are many ways of analysing it now. So in that respect, I'm more optimistic because with the data around, there are people on their websites doing it, there are independent institutes doing it. I think there is much more scope for that. On some of the improvements, one, I mean, I mean, certainly compared with when I took over as director, on the policy-making process in Whitehall, a lot of good ideas have been adopted. Now, how much difference that will make, we'll have to see. And I'm not claiming in any sense victory. I mean, going back to what work centre, this is desirable change. It's far, far too early, as I indicated, to say how much of a difference it has made. And it depends, as the questioner asked, quite rightly, on the willingness of people at central and local to listen. Above all, it's the politicians, I think. Where I have some hope, and it's very interesting this, is the work we're doing with the political parties and indeed with the civil service ahead of the election, where there's a real recognition of some of the dilemmas I've talked about on both sides. And people recognise that. I mean, exactly the same as Francis Mordy's implementation team with Nick Bowles did before 2010, so some Labour people do now. That when we have done presentations on the risks, and it's all public, going back to the question, it's all stuff we've done in public. I'll give you a classic illustration. We did a presentation to one group of politicians. Normally politicians spend their time on their BlackBerries. Some took notes. And one of my team sitting behind me, who knew these people extremely well from his past job, nudged me and said, "Look, they're taking notes, Peter." That we regarded as a success in its own right. Not exactly an obvious success matrix, but anyway, you do with what you can. So I think there's awareness of partly because of time of constrained resources, that everyone is thinking resources are constrained. And I think that in itself can lead to better behaviour and the realisation of risk, that people aren't making rash promises, they're recognising, well, we've got to make do with tight resources. So I think utopian, oh great. But I think I do see some possibility for some progress in some ways, merely because of those constraints. Well.
Simon Briscoe. I've got various affiliations, but since you are so kind about Full Fact, I'll say that I'm a trustee of Full Fact. I'm a great fan of your institute, but I don't think on your website, or at least don't think you have a programme of work that points out the failings of policy implemented by governments. And I do wonder whether this would be a good thing to highlight, partly because it might stop government being quite so stupid if they thought they might be pointed out, but also it might do something for public confidence. If I can just give you one example, up in North London where I live, Hampstead Heath is about to be fortunate enough to get some dams built on it. And this is thanks to a piece of legislation that went through in 2010, and the engineers have interpreted this as having to protect against well, there are many daft reasons why this is daft, but given we're in a place of statistics, the engineers have interpreted the dams must be built so that they can withstand a rainfall event of 1 in every 400,000 years. I mean, given London's only been around for a couple of thousand years, that seems quite a large number. You know, as this story has gone around, it's just alienated a whole swathe of sort of fairly clear-minding opinion formers. And I just think an act like that and its interpretation does so much damage to public confidence in the process of government and professions and the civil service. And I just wondered if there's any process to stop that, or whether your institute could do anything to help point these stupidities out.
I'm also in North London. I live in Kentish Town, and I know exactly what you're talking about. And of course, your protest really should be aimed about a mile down the road at the City Corporation, because they run Hampstead Heath. On your point of failure, we do. I mean, we do point out we did our work on public sector markets and commissioning has been full of pointing out failure. Our work on ICT has been absolutely full of pointing out failure. So we're not Panglossian saying everything is wonderful, far from it. But what we try and do is do it, it goes back to the first question, in a tone which is constructive, is how you can improve. Not you're bloody awful, but how can you improve? Because that's, our view, is the way to persuade people to improve. People don't like, I mean, people will accept criticism when it's put in a positive, constructive way. It's not that we pretend everything's fine. We certainly don't. I mean, the whole series of things we're doing about civil service leadership, functional leadership in government is highly critical. But we try to say how you can get it better. That's our approach. And actually, policy successes are quite interesting. The failures it attracts the attention. Some of the successes is actually more helpful and long-term to point to ways forward. But we don't ignore failure at all in that respect. I can't promise that we'll devote ourselves to the dams and Hampstead Heath, apart from my personal commitment as a local resident.
Okay, come forward to Will here. First one coming.
Will Moy, Director of Full Fact, and I will echo both Sharon's comments of thanks to the RSS and the Institute for Government for the great work you do, and also Simon's thanks for what you said about Full Fact's contribution.
I was looking at the website today. I mean, you're bang up to date with everything on that, which is really fantastic.
Thank you very much. And it's Laura and my other colleagues who are to thank for that. But I wanted, based on actually some years working in Parliament, to pick up what you said about pre-legislative scrutiny and ask about post-legislative scrutiny, which is, in my view, a rather underserved field, and certainly very lacking in formalisation compared to even the progress we've made on draft bills and things. And with John standing beside you, I wondered if you'd like to comment partly on the level of research and information support given to members of Parliament in trying to fulfil that function. And I say that with absolutely the greatest of respect for the House of Commons Library and the work it does, but is it actually enough?
The problem is a different one to my mind. I mean, I totally agree with you that in post-legislative scrutiny, I think it's really important. It's the interest of members. Everything to do with Parliament is to do with, are there incentives for members to get involved? And an insufficient number regard it as interesting business. That's the real blockage in my mind. There is a resource constraint, sure, but I think the real thing is that if members can see this is important and interesting work, and that I think is absolutely crucial. And that's what I'd say. More of them have got to be persuaded, looking at how a certain act is before. One of the things, funny enough, where we are now in the Parliament, I was talking to the liaison committee and all the select committee chairs at an informal session they had, and I was saying to them, one of the things they ought to do in the final session, they're not going to be able to do many big inquiries, Parliament isn't going to be sitting for very long, is actually do a form of that. It's to look back at all the policy initiatives in the first year and see how they worked out. So it's not. It's a version of post-legislative scrutiny. It's a bit early actually to look at the Health Act, let alone universal credit, and some of the other things, tuition fees. But it's partly to look at some of those early initiatives, and that ought to be a big part of what select committees do. I agree with you, but it's getting the MPs interested in it.
Now I've got 2 more waiting at the moment. 3. Anyone else? Okay, so the 3 that I've got waiting. So gentleman here in the middle. Keep coming.
So, John King, I'm a PhD student at Royal Holloway. I was intrigued by a comment you made right at the start about giving the media regulator responsibility for regulating the use of data by newspapers. And you said something along those lines, and I guess I think it's particularly important because there's been so much focus on the use of evidence by central government. And government excuse me. Government can only act with the consent of the people.
Yeah.
If people aren't accepting the evidence, then however well that government accepts it, then they're going to struggle to get legislation through. So I wondered whether you could.
No, well, I wasn't saying, even with all the hoo-ha after Leveson, that there should actually be made a responsibility either of Alan Moses's regulator or anything like that. I wasn't making it formal. I merely think they should talk to full fact. They should be aware that it's not some of the problems relate to factual as well as false allegations and unethical behaviour. That's what I was meaning. I mean, I certainly don't think you can more formally do it than that. It's another vehicle which puts up the pressure for accuracy. That's what I'm saying on that. And a lot of it is, I mean, I'm very conditioned, because I say I used to do the polling for the Times. And I was actually on the panel of the British Polling Council, which is the main pollsters, to do with if there were complaints. I think I only did one, but on the whole, they were quite an efficient self-regulating body because of their own reputations. Also, by sticking together, they could protect themselves against clients who wanted to behave dodgily by hiding what they were doing, and therefore they insisted upon disclosure, blatantly obvious disclosure of sample size, methodology, full questions, which certain media and other clients weren't so keen on. And they insisted on disclosure of that. And that was actually a protection for themselves as much as anything else. So I think I think the pressures have got to be kept up in those areas, because a lot of the presentation I see of polls in papers is so misleading in many respects that those type of pressures, I'm not talking about nothing more than informal pressure.
Well, don't pull back too far. Right, next one is just in front here.
My name's Tony Brophy. I'm an accountant by profession, and for the purpose of this evening, I'm a member of the general public. You mentioned the importance of good data policy making. As such, could you comment on the need and relevance and usefulness of the huge amount of data being collected on us all by GCHQ in terms of good public policy making?
Tony and I are old friends. I think, to be fair, that's a rather different subject. The only point I'd make, there's a big difference between the data they have the potential to collect and what they actually collect. That's the whole story about that. The meta I can't remember when I got the phrase right, their potential to collect data and what they actually collect is a very different story. But that's a different subject. I'm much more, well, for all kinds of reasons, more relaxed about these issues than many are. But that's a wholly different thing, which we can pursue on another occasion, Tony.
Okay, and the final question was towards back here.
David Matz from the official statistics section of the RSS. I was very interested, the title of your talk and your emphasis is all about informed decision making, and you talked a lot about ways that we can provide better evidence, but is there any evidence on what will make those who need to be informed, the decision makers, not just go with their gut all the time? Are there some countries where they're better at using evidence and are more willing to accept that things have gone wrong and more open and frank? And how could we change that culture?
Yeah, that goes back to the utopianism question. I think that there are two things which lead me not to be totally pessimistic and saying, oh, well, it's the way of the world. One is the fact that we're living in a period of public sector austerity. Therefore, getting cost-effective solutions matters, and therefore the evidence and data you can get is very important in that respect. If you can get a more cost-effective solution, if the evidence shows that doing it in one way is going to produce that, the better. The second is, it goes back to, I think one of the points made earlier about the looking at disasters and failures, which was raised at the back by the gentleman concerned with the dam on Hampstead Heath, is that the record of failure is also a corrective in itself. That people don't want to be the next person to cost billions of pounds on a disastrous project. I'd inject into discussion there the work of Margaret Hodge. Margaret Hodge isn't the most popular person in Whitehall, and her methods are open to interesting debate. But the way the PAC is operated is a deterrent as well. The session of reports, the work of the NAO, and so on, that's a deterrent. You don't want to be a permanent secretary who's going to get, why have you wasted 500 million? And I think there is now a higher level of awareness of some of the problems there of mucked up big projects. The existence of the Major Project Authority, which I only referred to, I think, in passing, is a really important innovation, providing a public check on the progress of big projects. Now, all right, we can all be cynical about the reset for universal credit, but we all know it's a problem project. A lot of others have got, amber if not red on them. That would not have happened. So failure has in itself produced a discipline to look at data more, to not allow things to ride along in the way in the past. There's still lots of problems on it. It's still very difficult for us also to challenge a minister on something if they're really committed to it. But if there is more scrutiny, more data available, if you've actually got a public body which is doing a continual checking on it, as the major projects authorities are, you could hope that failure will be spotted earlier. In 5 years' time you'll say, what a naive guy. But actually I think there's potential for doing things better.
Peter, thank you very much. I mean, you've given us some wonderful insights from your unique vantage point in the Institute for Government that I think has given us lots of food for thought. You've been optimistic, if not utopian, I think, in your kind of feeling that the future could be bright if only we grasp this opportunity. And there are some signs that we are capable of doing it. And you've been very generous in your answer to everyone's questions. So on behalf of all of us, thank you very much for coming on.